Hey everybody, you'll never guess who it is, it's Jeff. This is going to be a quick screencast on stasis procedures. Now I asked you to discuss the stasis procedures in your response that's due, I guess next week on Monday. And some of you have already done that, but I thought maybe we could do a little exercise around it just to make sure we're all clear about what are the stasis procedures. Kind of, build up some context around what you might have read of in your textbook and make sure we're all on the same page. But first, a couple of housekeeping issues. I've been grading your first projects. It's been some great stuff. I've been getting through those pretty quickly. I've been very busy. I mean, if you need evidence, why else would I not have had time to shave or get my hair cut, for instance, if I haven't been spending all this time grading the final drafts of your first project? Anyway, I should have those back to you, I think, all of you on Monday. So look, keep checking your email obsessively, waiting for that to come in. But it should be, if not already, or not earlier, sometime on Monday. Second, now we're going to move into project 2 kind of in earnest next week, but you've all picked the book you want to work with. Your main objective right now should be getting a copy of that book from the library or somewhere else so that you have it ready to start working on it right away, because the deadline for the rough draft of that's going to come up. I think it's about 2 weeks from today, how I've figured out in our schedule. But we can talk about that, and if you have trouble getting a copy of the text, get in touch with me and we can talk about that as well. I do have some extra copies of some of these, and maybe some other ways you can get a hold of them. But anyway, if you're thinking about the rhetorical analysis project, working ahead, get your text, start reading the text. You can start thinking about the major argument of that text. And if you want to look at the student examples on the page, they'll give you some good ideas about how you might start coming up with, kind of strategies in your own text by looking at the strategies those authors identified to work forward on project 2. But again, if you want to wait on that, that's fine. We're going to talk about that in great detail starting Tuesday of next week. Okay? All right, but again, the main purpose of this screencast is to talk a little bit more about stasis procedures. So if you slide on down our schedule page and click on here under notes, the stasis procedures, you'll see I did a little breakdown here. So here I'm going through the stasis. Sometimes, let's be honest, stasis is a hard word to say. I'm not the only one. Certainly if you've been saying it at home, you've been having some difficulty with it as well. All right, so the stasis procedures as they were identified in your textbook, and then we're going to look at a couple of examples, and I pulled some examples from your second response, right? So again, this is the response you did last time. You may have wondered, why did I never refer back to those responses? Well, I was saving them in reserve to use for this exercise. So I was thinking ahead there. That's just one thing I have in common with evil geniuses. Okay, so let's take a look at the first kind of stasis procedures that were mentioned in your book. Now again, the thing to keep in mind here, if I know stasis seems like a weird word and maybe some of this terminology seems pretty complicated, but you're already making these kinds of arguments that are called the stasis procedures, intuitively and all the time whenever you're making arguments or really just talking about any kind of controversial issue. Now, as your book mentioned, these terms developed from ancient Greek legal theory, and they often arise whenever people disagree about a certain issue. These are different categories you could use to ask questions and also to make arguments. So let's look at a couple of examples. So if we have questions around definitions or categories, we're trying to think what is the nature of a thing, right? How can it be included in a particular category? So a great example of category and definition stases were actually in our first project. So we looked at a genre, and how do you define that genre, right? So then we talked about subgenres, and you can think about, well, what are the particular attributes that something have that make it belong in that category of subgenre? Or, what is the meme as a genre? How do we define it as a genre? And we come up with different, kind of characteristics it have that put it within that genre. So, the debate over whether Pluto constitutes a planet is a debate that revolves around definition stases. Whoops. I clicked on one of the links, sorry. Debates that maybe are a little old now around how to define detainees at Guantanamo. Are they prisoners of war? Are they criminals? Are they terrorists? How do you define each of those terms? How does it fit in? And here's a couple examples from your second response. So again, this was Emily's, and when she was answering the question, again, if you don't recall, the question you're all answering for this response is you're trying to decide with one of the different articles we read for whether Google is making us smarter or Google is making us less smart. So Emily's response involved kind of redefining intelligence. So she divides it into different categories here. So we have street smart versus random information versus book smart versus career beneficiary. Those are all categories that we could put different things that Google does or different ways that Google affects our abilities to do these things in. Jenny took a similar approach here, right, where she mentions I think it's down here around the third sentence. Strong arguments can be made from both sides. In order to answer the question, we have to consider the definition of smart in present-day terms. So Jenny went right to a definition argument there. So let's take a look at stasis. This is one you should be familiar with. Whenever you decide if something was good or bad, a good or bad idea, whether it was worth doing, or whether some type of thing is a good or bad something else. So if you want to think about it again in reference to our previous project, when we thought about different things, you'd have to first define a subgenre, and you could think about whether a particular meme fit in with that genre. But you could also say whether one was a good or bad execution of that meme. If it had all the characteristics, it was done well. If it was funny, it was done well because it's supposed to be funny, and so forth. But here's some other evaluation ones. Debates over whether the bank bailouts were a good idea. You could talk about whether it's wikis are an appropriate tool like we use for classroom use. And in your responses, pretty much I put every yon here, but I'll change that to pretty much every one from your second responses, because you were evaluating something. To ask whether Google makes us smart or less smart is to suggest it does something good or bad to us, because we'd all presume that we'd want to be more smart, or at least not less smart. So you're all making evaluation arguments there. Let's look at a couple other ones. Resemblance is one that was not mentioned in your textbook, but it is kind of implied. Basically, whenever we make a resemblance argument, we're going to try to compare two different things. And usually people try to compare something that people have mixed feelings about or undecided about with something they already have strong feelings about. So for instance, if we argued that internet addiction is like drug addiction, what effect is that going to have? Well, most of us would agree that drug addiction is a bad thing. So it makes internet addiction look like a bad thing, something that's very serious, and so forth. Similarly, a lot of people compared the Iraq War to the Vietnam War. Now that's because, again, a lot of people have bad memories or bad feelings about the Vietnam War. A lot of people think, after the fact it was a mistake, or that, it took too long, and other things. So comparing those two things in an attempt to make people feel like the newer thing or the more undecided or more ambiguous thing has a lot of the characteristics of the other thing. So let's take a look from one of your responses to the second response prompt. This is from Mayers. So he here compared Google to the library. So like 50 years from now, Google will be thinking like the library was. Now, what kind of effect does that have? Well, I think that's a positive thing for Google, right? Because people generally like libraries. But that resemblance also shows the pace of change, right? Libraries were controversial when they first came into effect. So maybe our response or our uncertainty or nervousness about Google is a lot like that, which might work to defuse it, right? So finally, let's look at cause-consequence. This is one, of course, that you'll see a lot of times. If we do something, will something good or bad happen from it? And did something cause something else? So whenever we have one of those things certain in our minds, like we want something to happen, then how do we make it happen? Or something bad has happened, what caused it to happen? What do we blame for that problem, right? So, will decriminalizing marijuana reduce crime? If you can argue yes, then you might want to decriminalize marijuana. Will raising the minimum wage increase unemployment? If it does, then maybe you don't want that to happen. Now, of course, you can't just make that claim. You have to then prove it. But those are the ways resemblance arguments tend to begin by, cause-consequence arguments tend to begin by making that connection and then proving how it takes place. So let's look once again at an example from your second response. So this was Farhana's here, and again, she's building up on, or talking about different consequences, bad consequences that could come from being too dependent on technology. So here we have the dire consequence of the mental and physical health of young children that could be caused by too much dependence on media and computer technology. The end of the sentence here was on how we might end up living in the fictional world of Wall-E, right, which is a bad thing. That was a satirical or a monitory film that showed a world that we don't want to live in, right? So that's how cause-consequences Stacy's work, and that was an example from one of your responses. And then finally, proposal. Here's another one or another Stacy's argument that we hear all the time, like, should we do something? Why should we do it? Or should we not do something, right? So should teenage murder defendants be tried as adults? Should gay marriage be legalized? These are the kinds of proposal Stacy's or questions that often get worked out around different issues of proposals. So again, most of your responses to the question, because it asked you to do an evaluation, were in that evaluation register, but we might find a couple of them that had certain kinds of proposals. So here's an example from Jessica's response. So here she mentioned, you must be intelligent enough to be able to filter out the good from the bad. You must still do your research and do these other things. So here's, in a sense, a proposal of different things you should do along with using Google in order to make sure we avoid the things that might be behind the argument that Google makes us less smart, without losing the things that help us, or that we believe are part of the things that allow Google to make us more smart, right? So those are Stacy's procedures. Hopefully, If you had a little uncertainty about how to work those out, look at these examples and maybe pull them from your responses as I did. What I'm asking you to do is essentially what I did with your responses for the second time. This is what I want you to do in your third response, right? So look through the 2 articles on drugs, find how those stasis procedures occur, identify them, and let me know, which argument you thought was the best, whether or not it relates to the stasis you picked. So anyway, that's the skinny on stasis procedures. Again, those are due, your response around stasis procedures is due on Monday. I'll be back with your papers on Monday, and then Tuesday, a series of screencasts working our way through doing the rough draft of Project 2. So have a great weekend, take care, and I'll be back soon.